This podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
Very much, Jan, for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
No.
No?
Very
okay, I'll try. I have a very weak English voice, but I'll try and project myself. So I'm now based at the University of Sydney, but I spent most of my academic career in the UK. So apologies for the slightly different title. I'll explain as we go on why that is the case. So this is the structure of what I'm going to talk about. I'm sort of going to explore sustainability as a concept, talk about how it might be applied to various issues in bioethics, look at some objections. No doubt you'll come up with some others, and we can have some discussion. So, as Jan said, my main focus for the last over 15 years has been on trying to articulate and explore what we mean when we talk about public health ethics. And basically my approach has been to try and focus on what I call a we ethics rather than an I ethics. So I think a lot of ethics, particularly in bioethics, where there's a correlation between thinking about bioethics just collapsing into medical ethics, there's a focus on the relationships between individuals, so individual patients and practitioners. And I'm interested in thinking about what difference, if any, it makes to think about ethics relating to groups in societies, populations, societies, communities, rather than just individuals. And one of the projects that I've been engaged with is trying to explore various what I call socially embedded concepts. So these are concepts like solidarity and reciprocity, community and trust. And the thought is that there hasn't been much work done on these concepts within the area of bioethics. So I think we not only need to expand from just thinking about relationships between individuals to thinking about larger groups, but we also need to expand our philosophical vocabulary, the kind of concepts, the kind of values that might be important to think about issues. And many of these concepts, I think, are particularly interesting because they're thick moral concepts. So they have both a descriptive and a normative component. And that makes them quite different from some of the other kinds of concepts that have been well discussed within bioethics. Now, since moving to Australia 2.5 years ago, I've become very interested in thinking about Indigenous ethics and what difference that might make, again, to expanding our vocabulary about ethics. So, within an Australian context where the English arrived in 1788 and immediately began exterminating the local population, this is a tradition that has continued for a long time, and I've got particularly interested in thinking about what do Australian Aboriginal ideas about the way that their societies are constructed, the way that they think about ethics, what can we draw upon within and fill out the Western tradition for thinking about ethical issues. And there are many kind of elements to this, such as ideas about sharing resources just being the natural starting point, rather than thinking about property and thinking about owning various kinds of substances and therefore there being your direct resources. There's an immediate idea about resources being common. That connects up with thinking about the relationship between humans and land as being something which is particularly important. And there's also this concept of sustainability, which is the main thing that I'm going to talk about today. Has anybody seen the film Embrace of the Serpent? No? Best film that I've seen in the last 18 months, and I watch a lot of films. So this is a film produced by a Colombian director based on 2 encounters between anthropologists, including the first one is a German, and it's kind of roughly based on historical cases, but it's about a confrontation between anthropologists and indigenous ways of thinking. And the film really nicely illustrates what difference it might make to actually think about more indigenous ideas about, for example, in this case, the Amazon River and fish stocks, and how there are various taboos on things like consuming fish at various times of the year, and how that has implications for thinking about how resources are shared. So if we think in a traditional kind of English, Western way about resources, fish are there to be harvested and to be sold. You derive benefits from that as a commercial enterprise. Whereas thinking about fish stocks on a river, where fish over the course of the year might migrate up and down the river, your consumption of those resources has implications for your neighboring tribes. And they might be groups who speak a different language, but there are various kind of social practices that are put in place which are ways of ensuring that these kinds of resources like food are shared in some way between different kinds of communities. So the original title that I gave was Ecological Ethics, and this is ultimately where I'm going to go, but this is more of a 5-year project than something to be talked about in 40 minutes. So I've decided to narrow it down and talk about sustainability as being an element here, but just in case there's anybody that's not interested in sustainability but just come to hear about ecological ethics, this is the slide for you. What I'm asking here are a series of questions that I think provide us with an opportunity to again reflect upon and perhaps expand the vocabulary that we have to think about ethics in general. So this is partly again through my experience of going to Australia and reflecting upon the inadequacies in my own approach to thinking about public health ethics over the last 15 years. I think thinking about public health ethics now, I think my own work has been too preoccupied only thinking about human beings. And what I'm interested in doing now is exploring what difference it makes to think about whole kind of ecological systems. Can we think about those as having value, and what does that mean for actually thinking about our ethical practices in general? And there's a whole kind of set of issues that we can talk about. I think I certainly want to explore over the next few years. So what kinds of things have moral value? You know, if we look at the kind of traditions in moral theory where we make distinctions between persons and persons are the things of value, and things are just stuff that we own, or we break apart, or we give away to other people, or we have various kind of extrinsic instrumental relationships with. It's only persons on that kind of account that have intrinsic value. So is that true? Is that enough to capture all the various things that have value? So then the question becomes, what counts as a person? Because that's the marker of value. And I think in the background here is an assumption that all the morally valuable things in the world are equally valuable. So when I say to some of my colleagues I'm interested in thinking about what kind of value we might attach to ecological systems or landscapes and so on, they very often come back to me with questions like, oh, so you want to attribute rights to mosquitoes or something. And that kind of question assumes that what we're interested in is picking out all the things that have value, and the assumption is that every single one of those things has equal value. And I don't see why we have to approach things in that way. There might be all kinds of things that have value, and they might be things that we can't actually combine in combinations, and there's no reason to think that every single thing that is morally valuable is equally valuable. So if you're here for ecological ethics, sorry, that's your slide. Okay, so I'm going to focus on sustainability, and what I'm going to do is go through some of the different definitions in the literature and suggest why there are some problems in many of them, and then propose a particular kind of account. It's not a very strict definition, and then suggest how this concept might work in relation to applying it to a couple of examples. So my focus here is very much on thinking about the poverty of the values that are articulated in most accounts of bioethics. So it seems strange to me that bioethics, by definition, bio meaning life, so all the ethics that covers life, why is there so little discussion of sustainability? Because you think, naturally, to my mind at any rate, it seems as though that would be a concept that you would expect to be involved. So there has been some discussion, but it's quite limited. And we can ask the question, why? And I think it comes down to a dominance of a particular set of assumptions about how we ought to think about ethics. So you can ask me about these later if you want, but this has been subject to previous work of mine in terms of critiquing the sort of focus on just thinking about the relationships between individuals, and a focus on a very limited set of values, usually built around some very narrow and particular conception of autonomy. Basically, autonomy is kind of negative liberty. So I think we can ask a set of questions, which I'm not going to exactly answer all of these, but I hope that what I'm going to say allows some kind of answers, gesturing towards answering these questions anyway. So to what extent is it a useful concept? I think it is. What kind of obligations follow, and how does it combine with other values? So normally what happens when somebody argues in favor of a different concept which isn't on the list of values or principles that you see articulated in bioethics, it just gets stuck on the list. And again, I think we have to be careful not to do that. So you see all the time things like you start off with the 4 principles, and then you add on solidarity perhaps, and you add on trust. But it's not obvious to me that these are of equal weighting or equal kinds of values. So there's a question about how combinations are made. Even if sustainability is something which is a useful concept, it's not necessarily going to be something that is relevant to every single example to be discussed in bioethics. So we can start off with asking a sort of series of general questions about what actually sustainability is, and if you look at the literature, I think you very quickly come to the conclusion that it's extremely under-theorized. It's a very vague concept that is used in all kinds of different ways. Now, many of the accounts are primarily descriptive, but presumably the reason why we are interested in sustainability is that there's also a normative dimension there. Normally when people talk about sustainability, they're talking about it as if it's a good thing. So is it possible to think about sustainability as being something that is sometimes a bad thing? I think once you start thinking about that, it's hard to think of examples where that's the case. But maybe there are some. So trust is another interesting concept there, in that superficially you might think that trust is always a good thing. But if you're trusting somebody that's abusing you, then that's clearly a case where it's not a good thing. So some work to be done exploring that kind of issue. But I think a very good place to start when thinking about sustainability is with the Brundtland Commission's extremely influential report. Notice that this is a concept of sustainable development, not sustainability itself. But I think we can turn it into an account of sustainability. So sustainable development meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And we can end up with some kind of account like the one I've got here. So sustainability requires that today's needs are not prioritized in such a way that future needs will not be met. So that's a kind of rough stab of what we're talking about in relation to sustainability. But what's interesting is that since 1987, there have been a number of attempts to try and either be more precise about what the concept means or provide alternative accounts. And one of the things that's interesting, I think, is that the discussion is about providing an account of the concept of sustainability, but very often it's not the concept itself which people seem to be articulating. It seems to be a whole perspective upon things, a way of living almost, rather than a concept itself in the stricter, more philosophical sense. So you get sort of ideas like this. And presumably the idea is sustainability is trying to make compromises and weigh different elements against each other. So the economy, equity, the environment. So each of these, presumably the thought is important, and we need to balance them against each other. So just focusing on one is not going to be the answer. So sustainability is a kind of balancing idea. Or you get, does the color come out? Yeah. You get ideas like this, again, different kind of flying saucer graphics. And here there's an explicit commitment to the thought that some kind of way of thinking about how these different elements are balanced against each other provides you with a commitment to environmental justice. Then you get people who are critical of some of these accounts, and so Farley and Smith come up with this idea about neo-sustainability, the ability of an activity to sustain a system by improving its quality and operating within its limits. And the reason for coming up with neo-sustainability is apparently sustainability is too vague. But again, once we start getting into ideas about rules, there's an idea about more than just a concept. You know, this is a commitment to a particular kind of lifestyle, perhaps, either individually or as a society. Or we get this 6 roots of sustainability. Again, if you're interested in a concept, how do these roots relate to a concept? Are they necessary requirements for sustainability? So if you had a situation where most of these were apparent but not all of them, does that not count as sustainability? What's actually going on? And we get some of the same things echoed again in 6 definitions of sustainability. Again, these seem to be, you know, there's a problem if you're trying to articulate what a concept is, using the very concept that you're trying to articulate within the definitions themselves. So we're talking about sustainable blah, blah, blah. How does that help us with thinking about what sustainability actually is? Or you can define it in the negative. So a practice, relationship, or institution is not sustainable if it undermines the social, economic, or environmental conditions. So it's a kind of attempt to say where sustainability is absent. Excuse me. So one thing this brings up is thinking about what sustainability isn't, which is it's not preservation, because some of the things that we are actually thinking about sustainability can actually undergo change over time. So if you're thinking about ecological systems, they do change over time, but we might still view them as being sustainable over that time. So it's not about preservation, putting environments in the equivalent of a museum. Okay, so thinking then about moving away from those particular definitions, I'll come back to a suggestion in a minute for how I think we, well, our starting point ought to be when thinking about sustainability. We can ask these kinds of questions about, is sustainability intrinsically valuable? And as I mentioned before, I think that when people talk in everyday life about sustainability, there's certainly an assumption that sustainability is something that is intrinsically good. Is that true? Clearly we don't want to sustain everything. So are we talking about particular kinds of entities, and if so, what are they? How do we pick out what's relevant? And I want to focus on a particular kind of good as being the kinds of things that we ought to think about as being key paradigmatic examples of what we ought to hold to be valuable in relation to sustainability. So where does this all leave us? Hopefully my quick tour through these various kinds of accounts leaves you with the impression that actually there's a lot of vagueness here. There's people who are approaching the concept from different directions. They have, I think, already, they're starting from a very strong normative commitment, and they're interested in sustainability as being part of a lifestyle rather than specifically in the concept of sustainability itself. Now we're getting to sort of issues related to what kinds of thing we ought to be doing when we're doing conceptual analysis. I don't want to argue in favor of necessary and sufficient conditions for the concept of sustainability holding, but I think we can come up with a sort of a rough idea of what sustainability is by thinking about all of those different kinds of definitions. And really this very much goes back to the starting point with the Brundtland Commission. So sustainability is roughly a commitment to a certain kind of justice. So ensuring the just distribution of a certain type of good through the maintenance of that good across time. Okay, so we've then got to sort of break that down and think about how these things apply. And some of the relevant considerations might be, we're talking about a good that is scarce and should contribute positively to welfare. That's welfare, not necessarily just human welfare. So welfare is to be seen in broad ecological terms, and we need to do a lot of work actually specifying who the relevant parties are, and again, thinking about ecological ethics rather than sustainability as part of that, that would be part of the project. What kinds of things are relevant? What kinds of things are valuable? That would be part of that project. So other things to note, as mentioned, I think sustainability has to be a normative concept. Do we have an obligation to sustain? I think it depends what we're talking about. If we focus on goods, then certain kinds of goods might be the kinds of things that we have an obligation to sustain. So the Magic Porridge Pot, I'm sure you're all very familiar with Grimm's fairy tales. When my kids were small, this was the story I had to read over and over again, so I've kind of had that repetitive thing built in. But does everybody know the story, Magic Porridge Pot? No? So this is the idea that you have a a pot that produces endless amounts of porridge. So if you're lucky enough to have such a pot, you actually don't have a limited resource. So in that kind of case, the good, in this case porridge, is not something that you need to think about sustainability into the future, because you have an endless supply of it. So certain kinds of goods are like that. Sometimes people talk about particular kinds of public goods as being things that are freely available like that. So clean air, for example, there's an assumption that's a public good, and it's your individual consumption of air is not going to have any impact upon everybody else. Now, of course, there are kind of interventions that can occur in society that result in poor quality air, and that has an impact upon people. But generally speaking, public goods are a particular kind of good, and Magic Porridge Pot goods are things which are, again, a particular kind of good that is limitless. So what we're more interested in here when we're thinking about sustainability are certain kinds of goods where your consumption does have an impact upon other people. So I'm going to start with an example, antimicrobial resistance, and argue that there are certain kinds of goods here that are good examples of resources that are consumed, and that therefore that has implications for other people in the future, and we need to think about that and take that into account. And drugs where antibiotic resistance develops are the kinds of goods where we need to, or we can actually invoke ideas about sustainability as providing a reason why we need to change our practices now to preserve those goods for others in the future. So a little bit of jargon. So antimicrobial resistance is a broad category of issues relating to developing resistance for a number of different drugs. The best example to focus on are antibiotics, and the fact that ever since antibiotics were developed, resistance has been growing. So there are various problems in relation to hospital treatment within a clinical setting, where you have various infections that now are resistant to many of the drugs that we have in place. And although officially it doesn't often come within the AMR bracket, in my view it should. You can think about the developments within tuberculosis and the fact that many of the tubercular drugs are increasingly resistant to treatment. And this is just a fact of biology about the way that bacteria, here again focusing on antibiotics rather than AMR in general, this is just inevitable that this will happen. So very often the solution that's proposed to issues in relation to antibiotic resistance is, let's develop some new drugs. And that might help for a short period, but over time it's inevitable that resistance will develop to those drugs as well. Bacteria are smart. You know, they are able to respond and develop and so on. But this resistance is not purely a biological feature, and there are various human interventions that have speeded up the process. So we're actively contributing to the speediness of developing resistance. And there's examples to do with inappropriate use of antibiotics. There's routine use in preventive surgery, for example, where they're given for a longer period than they're really necessary. There are various kind of commercial elements here to do with the use of certain antibiotics in farming. So most of you, I'm sure, are meat eaters. If you are a meat eater, then your meat can be a little bit cheaper if you use antibiotics in farming, because the animals grow faster and so on. So within a European context, there might be regulations to prevent this, but in a global context, there are other parts of the world where this is going on. Antibiotics are freely used, and that's going to have an impact in countries where there are bans on the use of antibiotics in foodstuffs. So there's a combination of agricultural, commercial, the use in veterinary medicine, dentistry, medicine, etc., etc. These are widely used things, and the more that you use them, the more you will be speeding up the development of resistance. And just to put this in some kind of perspective, these figures have been disputed, but the O'Neill report from the UK argues that the impact of growing antimicrobial resistance is going to be huge in the future. So you can see O'Neill is actually an economist, so everything has to be reduced down to US dollars. But you can also see the impact in relation to the number of people that are expected to die. So significant problem. And of course, the impact of this is not going to be the same around the world. And that's partly related to the kinds of different practices in relation to antibiotic use in different countries. But generally, the trend is towards greater and greater resistance, even though there might be differences between particular countries. If you look at Europe, for example, there are very significant differences between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. And these relate to cultural practices in relation to how easy it is, how acceptable it is, the expectation in relation to the taking of antibiotics, even for conditions where it's inappropriate, such as for colds and flu and so on. So when you have a virus, antibiotics are not going to do any good. And in many countries, doctors will tell you that and they'll refuse to give them to you. In other countries, you will have access to them. Some of that is to do with culture, some of it is to do with healthcare systems. So when you have a healthcare system where the doctor actually gets a financial reward from providing drugs, surprise, surprise, you see higher rates of consumption and then higher rates of resistance. That one? Okay. Okay, so there are all kinds of issues relating to MMR that I won't go into, but one of the most interesting is thinking about the impact in relation to future generations. So our consumption now has consequences for others. And we can think about using the concept of sustainability to say something about that. So there are various kind of, like with everything, there are various arguments you can make in relation to this. And some of them are self-interested and prudential. So it's in your individual interest to have fewer antibiotics used. But I wanted to focus on thinking about sustainability as this really being an argument to illustrate how sustainability might make a difference to thinking about this particular bioethical issue. So do those in the future have a claim such that we're obligated to sustain antibiotics for use in the future? I want to argue yes. And I think this makes it an interesting case. The case that needs to be made out is that when we think about justice, we're often thinking about justice and distributions at a particular point in time. And this requires us to not just think about distributions at time t1, but also think about what impact that might have in relation to the future. So if we think about antibiotics as being a particular kind of good, I want to argue that they're not a public good. They are the kind of good that more consumption now means that less is available in the future. So they are a finite good. It's not a magic porridge pot. These are what I call here banked goods, using the metaphor of a bank. So when your measly salary goes into the bank and you keep spending against that, it will disappear before the end of the month, before your next salary check comes in. That's the nature of these kinds of goods. And antibiotics are exactly the same. The more that we use them now, the less they will be available in the future. And why this is important is that if we're using them for what we might consider to be relatively trivial uses now, maybe uses that are unnecessary, and that means that they are not available in the future where they really could be crucial to saving somebody's life, then isn't that a serious issue to do with the ideas to do with justice? So again, let's assume that we're living in a country where antibiotics are used in agriculture. You know, are you happy that you're paying 10 cents a kilo less for your meat, and that will mean that your grandchildren will die from not having antibiotics available? You know, when we have the same drug that we could use in those different ways, those are the kinds of, it's a slightly philosophical example rather than a real world example, but the idea is those are the kinds of choices that we might have to face. Now, it's not an argument for saying that people in the future are more valuable than people now, but it relates to thinking about what the balance of the harms and benefits might be. Lives saved might be far more important than thinking about the relatively small differentials in the amount that you pay for meat. Or satisfying a desire. You believe that you have this bad cold and that last time you had a cold, the antibiotics did you some benefit, therefore you want antibiotics now. Satisfying that preference is not equivalent to saving somebody's life in the future. Okay, and I just wanted to say this isn't an argument just about antimicrobial resistance or antibiotics. We can think about sustainability as something that's relevant when we're thinking about health systems as well. So if you're interested in health resources and the constant focus that politicians have to argue that resources in health are limited and we have to have some kind of, they usually don't talk about rationing, but that's what they mean. In that kind of idea, one of the arguments that they could use in at least some context is to think about sustainability arguments. So if we have a health system set up with various kinds of demands upon it, it might be that we need to think quite seriously about not just the distribution now, but also thinking about future distributions. If we completely destroy our healthcare system by spending everything now, isn't that a problem? So there are many other kind of cases where we could think about sustainability as being something that's relevant to arguments in bioethics. But I just wanted to say a little bit about health systems so that you don't get the idea that this is just about antibiotics. There are complications as well to do with health systems, as I got there in brackets. You could have other kinds of arguments for thinking about arguments that are going to push in the same direction as sustainability, ones relating to reciprocity and solidarity. Okay, so traditional objections to the idea about sustainability. Remember, thinking about the resources that we have now and thinking about our obligation to sustain those into the future for future use. I'm just going to talk about two standard objections. One is from an economist, and the other is a more philosophical objection. So it's very often the case that when economists are thinking about valuing various proposals, they proceed to offer some kind of discounting upon future benefits or harms. So the thought is that for $1, a euro that's spent now, that's has immediate benefit, whereas if you spend it in the future, because it's in the future, it has less benefit, and we can argue about what the relevant kind of discounted rate might be. So an argument for saying that sustainability is not something that we ought to focus on in these kinds of contexts is to argue that we actually get more benefit through interventions now, through distributions now, rather than thinking about holding on to some resources into the future. And I want to argue that this kind of assumption is essentially a feature of the model that economists are using, and where you have a future benefit, it's still a benefit, and you get into some paradoxical situations if you take this too seriously. So an argument, for example, against vaccination, where the benefits might come in 10 years' time, because the benefits are in 10 years' time, we're supposed to attribute less value to that benefit because it doesn't happen today. So there'll be a systematic undervaluing of the idea of prevention. Ironically, it might be that you get better economic returns from waiting for people to be infected and then treating them, rather than seeking to prevent those interventions occurring. So I think it's worth being a little bit skeptical about some of these models. As I say here, it might work for roads, but it's not obviously the case that it's going to work in relation to healthcare examples. And the second objection, I'm sure many of you in the audience who have a background in philosophy will have already thought about this one. So there's a standard objection to thinking about the obligations that we have to future generations, being very influential from the work of Derek Parfit. And the idea there is that we have to deal with the non-identity problem. So we're not talking about in the future, when we're making decisions now about the future, we're not talking about particularly existing individuals. They're not real individuals. They're kind of future individuals that will come into existence. We don't know who those individuals are. And the argument goes that the very fact that they will exist in the future is of benefit to them. So the choices we make to use the resources now only have impact in the future, but the impact on whoever those individuals are will actually occur. So the response here is to say that someone's not born as a result of a child dying in 6 generations is not harmed. Okay, so that's the Parfitian non-identity objection, but the reply is that our obligation is to future persons as a class. So it's true that we can't actually specify who those persons are, but we do know that unless the world explodes and all humans are exterminated or whatever, that there will be future persons, and we could take a gamble on the fact that there will be future persons. We can't name them, we can't identify them, but we know that they will exist as a class. And that might be enough to get round this particular objections. So whoever exists, their lives will go better if these drugs are actually sustained into the future. And again, it's partly to do with this idea about the differentials between the harms and the benefits now versus the harms and benefits in the future. The satisfaction of your ill-informed preference to have antibiotics inappropriately now is not of equivalent weight or greater weight than saving somebody's life in the future, even if we don't know who those particular individuals will be. So my conclusions are that when you think about sustainability, we've got to do some more work on refining the concept, but it's essentially something that is related to thinking about distributions and thinking about justice. I've given a couple of examples of how it might apply in different arguments about bioethics, and maybe this links up with a whole discussion about environmental justice, or some broader account of justice beyond more narrow accounts that we very often tend to focus on in these kinds of discussions. So I'm sure there'll be lots of things to talk about, but this is I'm not big on pictures in PowerPoint, as you can tell, but this is a picture of Sydney, just to... It's 38 degrees in Sydney at the moment, so it's a bit warmer than here.